Good afternoon. I'm glad you're with us this afternoon. It's been quite a serious weekend in terms of the murder, the assassination of the rapper AKA being seen as a national demonstration of the power of violence and assassins in our country, and more particularly perhaps in KwaZulu-Natal. As you know, AKA killed along with his friends Tipz Motsoane. They were killed outside a restaurant in Durban's Florida Road on Friday night. The killing looks entirely deliberate. The person points a gun directly at AKA and then pulls the trigger. It comes after so many other assassinations, particularly those involving both politics and the taxi industry in KwaZulu-Natal. Dr Jean Redbath is a senior researcher at the Africa Criminal Justice Reform at the Dullah Omar Institute. Dr Redbath, good afternoon to you. There are indications, anecdotal evidence, that there's been a big increase in this kind of killing. Do the numbers bear that out? Have we had a big increase in assassinations?
Well, we've certainly had a very worrying increase in murder as a whole, and that's particularly in KwaZulu-Natal and to a lesser extent Gauteng. If we compare to 2019 figures, KwaZulu-Natal has had a 52% increase in the last quarter in the number of murders. That is really, really worrying, and to a lesser extent Gauteng at 36%. We know that those two provinces have very strong links, and often their trends go in tandem with each other. They're close to each other, they're close links, transport links. But I think what we're seeing in KwaZulu-Natal is particularly worrying.
What is driving such a big increase in the murder rate, 52%?
Well, I think, when in the case of KwaZulu-Natal, we have a long history, firstly, of under-policing. The province is severely under-resourced in terms of police resources, and that dates from the time of the transition when there was an attempt to quell the influence of the former KwaZulu police, who were informed and brought into the South African police. Those numbers have not caught up over time, so we're still basically seeing the policing patterns that were present in 1994, leaving a huge gap in policing in the province, and almost the abdication in some areas to traditional leaders. So there's a long history of under-policing. There's a long history of political and taxi violence. It's the only province that has had multiple kinds of government of different political persuasions, and we may see that change again in the next election. And so there's a great deal of contestation, and I'm sure that the 2 years of lockdown also helped to boost organized crime, which has always been strong in the province and has always actually had links with elements of policing in the province.
How closely linked is violent crime, this kind of killing, to the availability of guns? And I mean, for a long time, a very long time, we've had a very large number of guns in South Africa. Has something changed? Are there more guns available now that could be linked to this?
Well, certainly what we've seen is weakness in policing and removing guns from the streets, and that's certainly part of what's happening in KwaZulu-Natal. What we've also seen is a worrying propensity of official institutions, including SAPs, to lose their firearms and for these firearms to be misused. The amnesty of a few years ago, where people gave in their firearms, 3,000 of those firearms were sold back into the system, and that really undermined people's confidence in handing in firearms. I think that was a once-off which really could have had a big impact, which unfortunately was undone by corruption within the police. So what we have seen is a weakness in policing, and that is definitely part of the problem. Part of what is supposed to happen is there's supposed to be organized, integrated operations where firearms are removed from criminal elements in the streets, and that's not happening in most of the country.
Okay, so then how do we get on top of all of this? And I mean, again, it comes back to a conversation around gun control, around trying to deal with illegal guns, perhaps legal guns too. This always leads to a huge argument, but it must surely be quite difficult to do to reduce the number of guns in our society.
Well, what's interesting is I'm sure we've talked about the LEAP program in the Western Cape previously, and here what we're seeing is that the biggest impact that program is having is through the removal of firearms, to the extent now that fewer firearms are being taken off the street, and what's being taken off the streets now are imitation firearms and homemade firearms, because the circulation is reducing. Now, that may change. They may get imported from other provinces. But at the same time, unlike the rest of the country, the Western Cape has had a marginal increase in the number of murders. So comparatively, that seems to be having an impact because those removals have been taking place in the murder hotspots. So, there's a kind of a negativity in our South African context where we say, well, policing doesn't help. But it can, and it does, if it is done properly.
Within all of this, there must clearly be, and I mean, we all know this, don't we? There's a large group of people who are prepared to kill for money. We now have, unfortunately, a sort of hitman industry in our country.
Yes, so it's part of the general devaluing of human life and the lack of seriousness attached to violence of any kind. We really need a zero tolerance for violence, and we don't have that in South African society. We tolerate certain kinds of violence. We tolerate revenge attacks. There needs to be zero tolerance for any kind of violence, and people are willing to carry out a hit for relatively trivial amounts of money, which is really of deep concern. And that's about our fabric of our society, of what is valued, and there needs to be a shift in that social fabric. And I just want to say that we've done this before as a country. This kind of scenario reminds me very much of the 1998 to 2001 era, where organized crime was running rampant, violent killings were running rampant, and steadily, as a country, we reduced the murder rate down to just under 30 per 100,000. Unfortunately, all of that has been wiped out and reversed, and we're back to where we were in 1998. But what history tells us is it is possible, and we can do it.
So where do we start? Obviously, this requires police work. It requires getting the guns. It requires all sorts of different things. But it also, I imagine, requires political will. It requires, so many people will tell me it keeps coming back to police crime intelligence as well. You need to get convictions for the people who commit the murders.
Yes, we definitely need. We need police crime intelligence. We need good detective work. We need our courts to be functioning more quickly. It doesn't help if it takes us 10 years for these people to go behind bars. We need to see that there are consequences, and less are the consequences visible because things take too long in our system. And that's not just the police. That's also the prosecuting authority. It's also the courts. The responsibility lies throughout the value chain. Of course, policing is where it all starts, and that's where we need political will. We need sensible allocation of resources. A province like KwaZulu-Natal is in dire straits, needs much more in terms of policing, much better policing, and right now that isn't happening.
Dr. Jean Redbath, thank you, Senior Researcher for Africa Criminal Justice Reform at the Dullah Omar Institute. Do appreciate the time.